With appointments in history, in Heinz College, and in ECP, Joel has played the role of acting dean at Heinz, at HNSS, and at GSIA. So once when I teased him about being the actingest dean, I know, he said it's probably because everybody knows that he doesn't want to be a dean in real. Joel is a pioneer of urban environmental history and the winner of the 2008 Leonardo da Vinci Medal, awarded by the Society for the History of Technology for contributions to the field of the history of technology. He was also one of the earliest winners of the Robert Doherty Prize of Carnegie Mellon for substantial and sustained contributions to excellence in education. Very widely published with 3 prize-winning books such as Technology and the Rise of the Network City in Europe and America, The Search for the Ultimate Sink, and Devastation and Renewal, and Environmental History of Pittsburgh and its regions, and numerous papers. Joel came to Carnegie Mellon in 1967 after receiving his master's and his bachelor's from Rutgers and a PhD in American history from Northwestern. In Pittsburgh, he found the confluence of the themes that have been the subject of his study since: industry, technology, and the urban environment and their mutual interactions. At CMU too, he found his colleagues, engineers who studied urban technological systems. The Society of History of Technology Award citation sums up Joel's work best in its news release of the Da Vinci Award. Headline: Enviro-techie Joel Tarr receives the Da Vinci Medal. It reads, since the 1990s, one of the most exciting developments in historical studies has been the convergence of environmental and technological history. Joel Arthur Tarr began to explore this convergence a generation earlier. His scholarship, both painstaking and pioneering, has pointed the way for many scholars now working at the intersection of technological and environmental history. From the late 1960s to this day, as a scholar, educator, and citizen, he has studied the interplay of human-built systems, processes, and values with the natural environment. Beginning his career as an urban historian, he asked new questions, examined new sources, and synthesized a new range of interdisciplinary approaches. At once an environmental, urban, and technological historian, Joel Tarr demonstrates the impossibility and irrelevance of labeling subfields when the unifying and ultimate topic is the story of humanity's interactions with the non-human world. Please help me welcome Joel.
Thank you, Indira. I really, that was wonderful. I really appreciate it. I've known Indira for many, many years. She's been an immensely valuable friend over these years, and she's made huge contributions to the university. The class that occupied this room before I came in was a class that looked at controlling dynamic systems. And as I thought about my life, I realized it was really dynamic systems out of control, you see. It's really quite a challenge to deliver a lecture like this or to think about it, because you try to puzzle out a balance between personal on the one hand and professional on the other hand. And you also have to think very carefully about how many secrets you want to reveal. Because I have been in administrative posts several times, of course, and I do have a chest of papers and digital recordings and things like that hidden away somewhere. The only problem is I forget where I put them, so they may never be revealed. At any rate, when one thinks about one's life course, it can become very philosophical. And you begin to think about issues like, well, maybe it's all an accident, all an accident. Or you think about the fact that without that opportunity, things would not have happened. Or you think about the fact that without that particular mentor who helped you at a key turning point, things wouldn't have happened in the way they did. So it's really you're trying to understand how you got to where you are, what key turning points there were, and what key events there were. Now, when I received this medal, the Leonardo da Vinci Medal, I was really astonished to receive it. First of all, because I don't think of myself as a historian of technology. And that's why the title of this talk is Why Technology? This was originally composed to try to, at the time I was being given that award, I said, well, why me, why technology? I'm not a historian of technology. I'm an urbanist, I can confess to that. I'm also interested in urban environmental studies very deeply. I can confess to that, and also the role of technology. But still, I am not a historian of technology, and I think my engineering friends would be astounded at the extent to which I think of technology as a black box. That is not necessarily understanding how it really all works. And I'm sure my wife will be glad to tell you what huge difficulties I have in operating the VCR and things like that without instruction bulletins and so on. So what I'm going to do today is try to trace some of the key events in my life, both personal and professional. I'm going to try to do it using some slides, some images. I like to do that. And I've really found, by the way, that since the coming of PowerPoint and all the images available to use in lectures, my research career has been destroyed because I spent so much time looking for images to use and putting them together in PowerPoints. But some of the things that have come up, of course, have been particularly interesting. Now, when I received the award and I had to start thinking about, talking about my career in some way, I had already begun exploring this somewhat because I had been asked last spring or winter to write an afterword for a book in honor of a very bright young environmental historian named Hal Rothman, who died of Lou Gehrig's disease at the age of 49. And the title of the book was Nature in Western Cities. And I said to the editor, well, I don't write about Western cities. I'm interested in primarily in Eastern cities, Midwestern cities. He said, it doesn't matter, just write something. So then I realized that while I was not writing or researching Western cities, I really had tried twice in my life very significantly to move into the West and to become a Westerner. That is, I made a trip to Arizona for a year in 1952-53. I'll show you something about that in a second. And then I went back in the 60s and actually taught in California for 6 years before coming to Pittsburgh. So the title of the essay, that is the essay that's the afterword in this book, is Escape to the West, Return to the East, the Lure of the City Familiar. And basically, what I do there is try to say, well, what is it, the magnetic force that pulls me out of the glories of Southern California and sunshine and ocean and all those things to dirty, smoky, industrial Pittsburgh? So that's a profound kind of question, at least it was to me. Now, I grew up in Jersey City, and I don't know if any of you know Kevin Lynch's writings about urban planning and so on, but he has a wonderful phrase in a book on urban imagery about people who go through Jersey City who live in Jersey City, or you ask them the question, have you been there? And they say, yes, I've been through it. I've been through it, because you have to go to Jersey City to get to the Holland Tunnel. You have to get to Manhattan in different ways. So you go through Jersey City. So it's a place where people actually go through an awful lot. But people do live there also. And it's basically an old industrial city across the Hudson Bay from Manhattan. And as I was thought about this talk that I was going to be giving for the medal first of all, and now again here, I realized what a large imprint Jersey City had made upon my consciousness, upon my head. It's stamped there, as a matter of fact, as I will explain a little bit, perhaps even more drastically than you might imagine. So Jersey City is, as I said, an industrial city, and I guess I pointed this here. And I want to start off with this image here, because this image includes a picture of my father. This is my father, right there. He's working at that time in the federal shipyards in Kearney, New Jersey. He was working at night in the federal shipyards, and he's working days in a supply house, plumbing supply house. You say, well, when did he sleep? Not very often. But obviously there was a lot of things technological artifacts in my life, technological images. And that picture, which was on the front page of a company magazine, actually the Navy was in charge at that time in 1943, had been saved by my mother. And I'm immensely glad I was able to reclaim it. And I've used it. I have it all over the place, my house and so on, and my son's house, my daughter's houses, because it's such a meaningful kind of image, you know, in terms of saying, where do you come from? What does that mean? And this is a picture of the shipyards that my father worked in. They were launching destroyers and other kinds of boats during the Second World War. This is the little hardware store that he opened in 1944. And that store existed from about 1944 to the late 60s. At that time, it went bankrupt because of competition from highway stores. And I worked in that store from the age probably of about 12 until I went off to college. And you can say, wow, more experience with tools and machines and nails and screws and all those wonderful things that relate to technology. Yeah, but I just sold them. I didn't necessarily explain how to use them. So, but it was a very important experience, obviously, in many ways. From the one place where I lived, during the war itself, I could actually see the Statue of Liberty. And then we moved in 1944 to another place, a relatively high place, from which I could look over the city, the downtown of the city, and see the Pulaski Skyway, which is right over here. And Jersey City is surrounded by an immense amount of industrial technologies, bridges, movable bridges of all kinds, old and new technology, mostly old, I think, probably. And it's impossible to get away from the fact that this is the center of some important stage of the Industrial Revolution. Now, living in Jersey City could be quite an adventure in terms of, again, technological systems and networks. This is a picture of an elevated streetcar that I used to take all the time. I didn't really think about it. I guess I got a little concerned about the fragility of the structure itself. But on the other hand, it was quite an adventure. And this is a picture of the Hudson and Manhattan tubes and the tracks there by which you would journey to Manhattan, which I did an awful lot, actually, beginning when I was about 12 or 13 years old. I took the tubes, as they were called, to Manhattan. Never thinking at that time, of course, that at one point in my life, I would begin thinking about subways, tubes, bridges, and things like that in a more systematic kind of way. Now, I used to ride this trolley car all the time, this streetcar. I was amazed I was able to find a picture of it, actually. But there were streetcars like that all over Jersey City. Just as like there had been in Pittsburgh, by the way, in 1960. By the time I came in 67, many of them were gone. But you know that before the First World War, actually before 1940, Pittsburgh had over 400 miles of streetcar track in the region. A lot of people rode cars like that we call light rail cars now, of course. Now, this is a very famous bus, as far as I go. Again, I was amazed to find a picture of it, because this is the bus that changed my life. Now, maybe you think a trolley car changed your life. You know, what is that? How does that song go? Clang, 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 and the bells of the trolley car, and so on. Well, this is the bus that changed my life. Well, how did it change my life? It changed my life because when I was 14 years old, it was a very gray, cloudy January morning, I ran into the side of one of these buses. With head down, bounced off the side of the bus, hit my head on the concrete sidewalk on the curb, and didn't wake up for 12 and a half days. And I suffered a brain concussion, obviously. I lost my memory. I lost my ability to walk. They couldn't operate because they didn't know where the pressure was in the brain. I remember vague memory of waking up in the hospital and saying, I got to get out of here. And saying, well, maybe I'm here for a reason, maybe I shouldn't. That's probably a story that somebody told me, but it sounds good at any rate. So this is an immensely important event in my life. That bus is a very important bus. Because it changed my life, not because I became a rabbit hunter, as this picture might suggest, but because after I had that accident and had to really relearn many, many things, I essentially took a very different direction in my life than the direction I had taken before then. I had read, always been a voracious reader of books, but I basically was not doing well in school at all. In fact, I was told at times my parents thought I might have been retarded. I was didn't do well in math, didn't do well in English, didn't do well in all those things. Did pretty well in geography and history. But basically, aside from that, not very well. I didn't necessarily focus. After the accident and after my recovery, I began to focus in a way I hadn't before. Now, did that mean I suddenly decided I was going to become an academic, and to move on and take that path, that journey? Well, not at all, as a matter of fact. But a lot of different things began to happen that were going to influence the track that I was going to take in life. One of the things I wanted to do very much was escape from Jersey City. Somebody read a book, there's a book actually by that title, Escape from Jersey City. I wanted to escape from Jersey City, and so I went for my freshman year in college to the University of Arizona in Tucson. I went out there, and I'd never really been out of Jersey City before that. I could have gone to the moon. Going from Jersey City in the New York metropolitan area to Tucson, Arizona, which had 90,000 people in it in 1950, was really a journey to the moon for me. And I had decided by Thanksgiving that I couldn't possibly survive out there. I tried. I bought a gun, as you see here. We'd go hunting with my Arizona friends and colleagues. And by the way, I only had, my friends were all, there are two sets of people at this university. One set were playboys and playgirls who came to have a good time. And the others were native Arizona people who had no money to have a good time, but they liked to hunt and sports. And I tended to hang around with the latter. So I bought that gun, and the only significant thing I ever did with it was almost shoot my roommate. But and I sold it before I left it. Now, so this escape from the place where you grow up, where you really have deep roots, is very, very significant. And let me tell you a little story that's out of chronology on this. And that is that in 1961, when I went on the job market for the first time, one night I received a phone call from a man who identified himself as Monsignor O'Grady, the Dean of the College of St. Peter's College in Jersey City. And he called me up and he said, he spoke to me, he said, listen, we've heard you're a very good teacher from your mentors at Northwestern, where I was doing my graduate work then. He said, we'd like to offer you a job right now over the phone. That was back in the days when there were a lot of jobs, obviously. Right now, over the phone. And I said to him, I was really stunned, and I said, stopped for a second. I said, Monsignor, where did you say you were from, Jersey City? He said, yes. And I thought for another minute, and I said to Monsignor, I don't mean to be presumptuous, and I'm very appreciative of the offer, but I must tell you that I've spent most of my adult life trying to escape from Jersey City. And that's a true story, as a matter of fact. So I ended up going to California, as a matter of fact, which I later wanted to escape from, too. So anyway, I left Arizona and I went to Rutgers University. And when I got to Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey, I looked around and said, how could I have possibly gone to the crass, undeveloped, uneducated, uncultured West when this kind of wonderful colonial college was within very close range of my home, 18 miles from where I lived. I actually lived on campus, but I used to come home every weekend and work at my father's hardware store. Very significant. It was significant not only because of the place it was and its meaning, it was significant because of the mentors that I was able to acquire there, in historians primarily, although a fellow in English too. It was a small school then. It was only 4,400 men on that campus when I went there in 1953, and there were about 1,100 women on the Douglas campus on the other side of the town. It was not integrated, males and females yet. So, and one day I was taking a history course in European history, and the professor said to me, his name was Henry Winkler, not the Henry Winkler. He said, what are you going to do with your life? And I said, I'm going to become a high school history teacher. And he said, no, you're not. He said, you're going to go to graduate school. And until, you know, when somebody says something like that to you, showing some kind of belief in your, you know, they see something there, it's immensely meaningful. And I've stayed friendly and close to Henry ever since then. He himself became president of the University of Cincinnati, executive director of the American Historical Association, and so on. But he, a very immensely important person, not the only important person there because of the professors I had that were wonderful mentors, very well-known historians. Well, in 1956, in September of 56, actually before that, in the summer of 56, I got a job at the Edison Laboratory National Monument in West Orange, New Jersey, as a ranger historian. Well, what did they do at the Edison Laboratory National Monument? They made technology. They made phonographs, they did chemical experiments, they did things with light bulbs, and they made movies. I used to show movies in the first movie theater, not theater, it actually was a studio that existed, the Black Maria, as it's called. And the machine shop at Rutgers was something I was quite familiar with. I used to show people around it. You begin to see the kind of threads that have to do with some kind of technology. I know it's old technology. It has nothing to do with the wonderful technologies that I struggle with every day here, but there were technologies surrounding me. Okay, so I did that, and then I left Rutgers with a master's and went to Northwestern University. And I studied in Northwestern, and I had some very fine teachers. But there are two events that stand out in my mind there in terms of how I trace my journey, and that is two things that happened that were primarily accidents that made it possible for me to survive, because I think without them I would not have survived. The first thing had to do with the language requirements for the PhD program. Most history programs in the United States at that time required two languages, usually French and German. Well, I struggled through my French, barely. How was I going to deal with the German? In the year before I came up for my examinations, they changed the requirement for people in American history from two languages to one language. Okay, no undue influence exercised. There's a stroke, or maybe somebody was watching over me. The second important thing that happened there that was really profound in terms of making really my survival involved my, my assumed dissertation director, a very well-known historian, his name was Arthur Link, the biographer of Woodrow Wilson. And I had taken my courses, and I was taking my prelims, and Arthur was there, and I was sure I had flunked the prelims. There were 4 people on the exam, 2 of whom I had never met, one of whom was my worst enemy in the department, and then Arthur. So I had about 2 hours of grilling, and I was sure I had flunked. And Arthur said, okay, go outside and wait on the steps. We'll come and get you when we're ready. I went out and sat on the steps, assuming I'd be there for at least an hour. And suddenly Arthur comes running out and says to me, really in one sense, he says, you passed, congratulations, do you have a car? What? How do you put it? He said, I forgot that today was my son's birthday. And I had promised to take him and his friends to the movies. And the movie is going to start in about 20 minutes. And I have to get home. I'm still convinced that without that, I would have certainly flunked my prelims, and had to take them again. Now, it may, I'm sorry?
Did you have a car?
Yes, I did have a car. And I knew how to drive it, too. It's really ironic that it happened that way. And Arthur was a well-known person who forgot a lot of things. And I'm reminded often by my wife that I'm always forgetting things, too, So I guess it's the role of wives to tell you that you forget most of the time, or all the time. Okay, so anyway, I went to Northwestern. I lived in Chicago for 4 years. And I began to feel about Chicago the way I felt about Jersey City. It no longer was an escape from Chicago alone. From Jersey City alone is now an escape from Chicago. When I was there, Chicago was corrupt, very corrupt, more than even now. It was filthy. They never cleaned the streets. They never took the ice and snow off the streets. It was a very difficult time, and there was a great deal of social turmoil. I lived for most of the time, I lived in Chicago on the South Side, which is one of the areas where there was an awful lot of clashing between whites and African Americans over housing questions. So I decided I had to get out of Chicago, and that I was going to go and I was going to accept the job that I was offered in California. I mean, California was the Golden West. It had to be quite different than Arizona had been. Arizona was very dry and had cactus all over the place. California was the Golden West. It had the ocean and so on. So I would go to the Golden West and try my life there, my experience there. And I went to what was then called Long Beach State College in Long Beach, California. A very unique kind of place, Long Beach, California, a fairly sizable city south of Los Angeles. Every year when I was there, they used to have a huge Iowa picnic. And they would have 100 to 150,000 Iowans who were living in Long Beach come to this picnic. So it was, for an Eastern kid coming from a ethnically, racially kind of mingled city of mingle, where people mingled, it was really astonishing to be in that kind of environment. And I was basically uncomfortable living in Southern California, even though, again, I had some wonderful colleagues while I was there. Let me just go on with this. This is pretty hard to take, you got to realize. Now, this happens to be the University of California at Santa Barbara, where I taught from 1965 to 1966, or 66 to 67, I'm sorry, as a visiting professor. But living in Southern California in the 60s was difficult. First of all, it was the 1960s, and I guess I don't have to tell you much more than that. But I was convinced that if I stayed there with all that sun and all that ocean and all those young, beautiful women in bikinis around, my research career was over. My life as an academic was probably finished. And it was very, very hard to focus. And I therefore began to look around to move. And I did finally move in 1967 from Santa Barbara, rather than go back to Long Beach. And I moved to a place then when I applied to it known as Carnegie Institute of Technology, which is located, I heard, in the industrial city of Pittsburgh, that I had actually visited once when I had a cousin of mine get married here, who married a young woman from Mount Lebanon, now divorced, by the way, but not particularly significant. So I came to Pittsburgh at that time, and there are still people that wonder how I traded that for that. I mean, what was going on? What kind of good sense do you have? And don't you really appreciate the good things in life? Well, the stuff I really appreciated was being, obviously, it seemed to me, in the kind of place that I felt comfortable with. And that was the kind of place I had grown up with. Kevin Lynch, again, has a wonderful book called What Time Is This Place? I could never tell what time the place was in Southern California. But in Pittsburgh, you always can tell what time is this place. I could always do that in Jersey City also. Now, I want to make a point about Pittsburgh and the university when I came here. The point is that they were both undergoing huge transformations. They were both being transformed. California was growing very fast, but I never had the feeling it was being transformed in any way except to extend the freeways and the tract housing. But Carnegie Mellon, Pittsburgh, was experiencing really at the tail end of what was called the Pittsburgh Renaissance, an attempt to really redevelop an old industrial city, the first major attempt to do this of any industrial city in the world. And it had made a number of strides forward, particularly in environmental ways, but it was still unfinished. You can see the two bridges of the Point still there. You can see Point Park is not developed yet, and so on along the line. This is a picture of the people that were running the show in Pittsburgh at that time, the Allegheny Conference on Community Development, which is headed, by the way, for 12 years by Rick Stafford, who was in my first class that I taught at the School of Urban and Public Affairs in 1968 and 69. Did Richard Stafford become a member of the elite? He certainly did. He was a power broker. He's also a wonderful guy. So these were people that were really had, in a way, a sense of the need to improve their environment in a way that a lot of other elites in other cities didn't have, because others just moved away to a different location. You have to realize that Richard King Mellon could have lived anywhere in the world he wanted to live, and people like that, and but they stayed. They stayed, and they tried to improve the city that they lived in. So again, while the city was in many ways dirty, smoky still, a lot of industry, it was trying to improve. You got a sense of the fact that there was a momentum underway. Okay, what about the university, though? Until 1967, Carnegie had been Carnegie Institute of Technology. It was no longer Carnegie Trade Schools as it had been, and certainly under Robert Doherty, particularly the president from the late 30s into the 40s, it had made large strides. And Doherty himself was quite involved with the Allegheny Conference and improving the city of Pittsburgh. So in many ways, in '67 when I came, it was a very exciting time, because at that moment, just about that time, Carnegie Institute of Technology had combined with the Mellon Institute, and the Mellon family had given them $12 million to help create a new college, the College of Humanities and Social Science. They had already received money to start GSIA a few years before that. And by the way, I was never dean of GSIA. I would have never accepted that place, being dean there. So, no, I was not GSIA, no. And even fine arts, I've never been acting dean there either. Although...
we're going to get you to do that.
Yeah, right. So, at any rate, it was very exciting to come to this place at that time, because it was undergoing vast change. And the two places I was associated with, I came with a joint appointment between the Department of History and the School of Urban and Public Affairs, now called the Heinz School. The SUPA, as it was called, not a soup, obviously, but it was a professional school, was a new college created. And HNSS, of course, in many ways, was enlarged from what it had been. And you had new things going on. In history, for instance, you had the creation of a Doctor of Arts degree. And the Doctor of Arts degree was really put forward under the direction of Ted Fenton, who was around here, a very significant person in the history of the university, and who ran the Doctor of Arts program and recruited people to that for some years. And I was the person teaching the required research seminar in the Doctor of Arts program. The people he recruited at the beginning were outstanding people. They were people that had been out teaching in many cases, or been, had played roles in the outside world. They weren't, wet behind the ears students. And some of them, from the 4 students that I came to direct who got DAs there, Doctor of Arts degrees, all did significant things. One was Mike Weber, who became tenured faculty member here in history, and later on became the vice president and provost at Duquesne University. Another one was Terry Yossi, who is now the CEO of the World Environmental Council, and Tony Penna, of course, who became the dean here and later became a provost at Northeastern University, and Jim Tomeko, who became head of the software engineering program here, the Masters in Software Engineering. You say, wait a second, where did that all come from? There were the history degrees, they were. Jim did his dissertation, by the way, on irrigation systems, central pivot irrigation systems in Kansas. Is my suggestion, and that just amazing growth on the part of these people. So they were really a great group. So we have super going on. We're Bill Cooper. Some images. This is just Pittsburgh stuff. Oh, yeah, Carnegie. It didn't look quite like this when I came. This is a little earlier, but it didn't look very different from this. And you might say even today it doesn't, but that wouldn't be entirely true. Notice the similarity between that machine shop at Carnegie Institute of Technology and the one in Edison's place that I showed you. Another thing about, this is of course right close to the time I came, you notice there that, it's not pointing, but you can see the streetcar there running up Forbes Avenue in front of right up by Warner Hall. When I came for my interviews, I remember sitting it was in the summer, and the fall, and seeing streetcars on Forbes Avenue. When I came back that summer to take the job, they were all gone. And to our great sorrow, I guess, in many ways. But basically, that decade and the following decade were very major turning points in my life. And let me just shift to the personal for a second, which I've talked about a little bit. And here again, an immensely catastrophic and important event in my life of a very different kind. And that is, in 1969, my first wife, who I married in 1956, died suddenly. And I had a 5-year-old boy and a 1.5-year-old daughter. And I was untenured also at that time. And I was immensely fortunate at that time, in spite of my huge loss, to have, through the help of friends and the help of a retired social worker who became really a wonderful baby nurse, a substitute mother for me, to help me for years, to really pull myself out of that period of anxiety and depression and to try to move on with my life and get on with my professional life. And basically, to get my children also, those 2 older ones, plus the 2 more I had later on, which I'll talk about in a second, getting them moved on a path in their life. My daughter, my oldest daughter, who has 2 degrees from Carnegie Mellon University, now is a social worker in Seattle. And my son, Michael, is the Fox Professor of Ophthalmology, whatever that is, and Visual Sciences in the Department of Cognitive and Linguistic Sciences at Brown University. So I'd say that they did all right. And I take, of course, great pride in how well they have done. And let me just talk about Michael for a second, the college professor. I don't know why he moved in the direction of cognitive science. After all, his father was a historian, even though he hung around engineers. It may have been because 3 houses down the block from our house, Raj Reddy lived on the corner. Raj moved in there, and just not too long after we moved there, in fact, on the other corner, Alan Perlis, who was the first head of the computer science department in this university, also lived when I first went there. So we were sort of surrounded by cognitive scientists in a way. And Michael was obviously influenced by being close to the university. We have an interesting story in the family. The story is that when he was growing up, I used to whisper in his ear, no English, no history, no philosophy, math, computers, science. Well, when he won, a few years ago in the APA, awarded him a Young Scholars or Young Early Career contribution to psychology. And he told that story in the biographical profile that he wrote up in the journal. One of my very good, talented graduate students had a wife in psychology, and she read it and saw it, and she showed it to him. And he came running into my office and said, well, what is that kind of stuff, talking to your son about history in that kind of way? So I said, well, he had good mathematical ability, and we didn't want to lose it. But at any rate, I guess he did forgive me. All right, now, my life changed very dramatically also again in 1976 when I met my present wife, Tova, who's sitting right here, and I can't point at her with a laser pointer because it's not a good thing to do. And Tova was, I met her either through design on the part of friends of ours, mutual friends, or by accident. So I'm not sure how to answer that particular kind of thing. Both, right. At that time, she was a graduate student. She's an Israeli. She had come to this country in 1971 to study, always intending to go back to her homeland. She was studying for a PhD in educational psychology at the University of Pittsburgh. We met, and 2 years later, I was able to persuade her to stay in this country, to marry me, and help me create a family. And we had 2 more children. We have 2 girls. We have 4 children now. One of them is in law school, and the youngest one who spent last year in Ghana is unemployed in Washington, D.C. So if any of you have good contacts, and so at any rate, I was immensely lucky because of the personal things that happened to me, the disasters on the one hand, but also my good fortune in being able to survive them. Okay, now let me go back to my professional life a little bit. And I don't want to your time. I don't know what your time is like, India. You want to?
Another 20 minutes.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. I mean, these 25, 30 years are easy to cover in that space of time, right? Okay. Now, when we turn now back from the personal to the professional, and in many ways, what happens in the 70s and the 80s is that I begin to hang out with different kinds of people. When I came to Carnegie, I was just finishing a study of urban politics in Chicago. But I began working on a question involving transportation technology and its impact upon the city. And at that time, we had an institute here called the Transportation Research Institute. It was located where Granger Morgan's domain is right now, engineering and public policy. And it was run by just the most elegant man, Jim Romaldi, who, he's dressed, always dressed exactly correctly. And he was quite scandalized when new faculty came into the College of Civil Engineering, like Chris Hendrickson, and never wore a tie and never wore a jacket. He didn't know what had happened to the world, you see, at that time. But Jim was a wonderful man, and he actually saw a use that a historian could be put to in the Transportation Research Institute. And they began funding my research, and I began participating with them. At that time also, though, and probably through the people in TRI, I encountered another group of engineers under the direction of another incredible person, Bob Dunlap. And this was a group of engineers, not entirely, but largely engineers from different engineering disciplines, who bought into a vision that Bob had about the kind of role that engineering should play in society. Not only a technical role, but a role that also involved taking on public policy problems, trying to deal with them, and doing things in a relatively broad, interdisciplinary kind of way. And I've actually have a number. Oh, this is Bill Cooper, by the way, who was the first dean of the SUPA. He's a former boxer, by the way, and one tried to avoid getting into too many arguments with him. But there's another thing I remember about SUPA, and I don't want to tell too many tales out of him. You know, what is it? Out of school, right? But I remember very well, SUPA used to always have an associate dean who came out of CIT. Well, SUPA used to hold its promotional meetings, its tenure meetings, at night, at a dinner. We had a dinner, it was a great dinner, steak dinner, whatever, sometimes. But they used to serve hard liquor at the dinner. Hard liquor. They were actually scotch and bourbon were on the table and so on. And I remember very well coming out after one of those dinners, and Bill Gauss, who at that time was associate dean between the two schools, said to me, "Tell me it didn't happen. I can't believe it happened." You know, it really was an incredible kind of situation there. Well, anyway, Bill, for whatever reason, was asked to step down by Dick Syatt, then the president, and his place was taken by Toby Davis, an economist who had been very, very critical in the founding of SUPA, and who told me some years later that he had really been the one who pushed for a historian. Now, he was a microeconomist, but he obviously had some kind of feeling that history could be useful in a certain way. This is the picture, by the way, of Ted Fenton, who I mentioned before, who was so important. I'm sorry it's such a bad picture. I just couldn't find a better picture of him. This is Raj Reddy. I'm sorry, that's Raj Reddy, who of course became the first dean of the School of Computer Science here, a very famous computer scientist, and my neighbor for many years. And Bob Dunlap. Bob Dunlap, who left the university and set up a firm called RETAC, it was a very, very important firm in the environmental area. A very successful firm, came back to serve as a university trustee here, played a vital role here, and then passed away suddenly just several weeks ago. Really a great tragedy. He's just a most amazing human being. And again, one of those people that you meet, and it's going to be a long time before you ever meet anybody else like that. Anybody you met and touched, of course, was immensely important, was immensely affected. Now, so let me just see, I had another couple of pictures. Okay, there's a few other folks that were in that early crew. This is this early crew of people that got involved with engineering and public affairs, as it was called then, later EPP. Francis McMichael, who was a sanitary engineer at that time, but later became an environmental engineer, was then at the Mellon Institute. And he was recruited by Bob to come over into that particular group. And in addition, Henry Peeler, a metallurgist who's still around, even though he says he's retired, works harder than he had before. Eddie Rubin, who's still around here, of course, and still active at EPP. And Peter Stearns, he's a historian. What is he doing with this bunch? Well, Peter was a person that I recruited, actually, in 1975. I was chair of a committee to come and fill a chair that history had. Again, luck, fortuitous. Peter was a very famous historian. We didn't, at that time, history was trying to move ahead, but, you know, it still was not a distinguished department. Why did Peter come here? Because he had had a severe divorce. And he had to get out of where he was and come somewhere else. And we offered him this chair and he came. So, you know, out of school, I don't think that's out of school. It just shows you how human, and how these things often affect the direction of events. Pat Crayson, who became the dean of HNSS in 1975, a Herb Simon student from GSIA, and later on became the vice president of this university, who also passed away last year, but a very significant figure. Very tough guy, became president of Georgia Tech after he left here. He was not successful down there, and I remember him saying to me, who could understand those Southerners? You know, just completely different mentality. So at any rate, there's a lot going on. I guess that's really what I want to give you a feeling of the fact there's a lot of change in the air. There were new programs going on. We had a feeling that Carnegie Mellon was really going to move ahead, that we were on the make as a university. And when Dick Syatt, as the president, it really gave you that kind of feeling of energy and going somewhere. We were relatively small still then. Everybody worked very hard, and supposedly Syatt went around and checked offices on Saturday mornings to make sure faculty in GSIA at least were in their offices. This is before you had home PCs, you see. And everybody knew that the slogan of Andrew Carnegie was, "My heart is in the work," right? So this is going to be the slogan of this university. So it was could be a very rough ride, you know, here. It could be tough. And a lot of people fell by the wayside, but if you worked hard, you know, it was possible to be a survivor. And I think more than that, it was possible to be a survivor by involving yourself in the university as a totality in terms of where it was going, rather than some special little kind of isolated niche, which might have been true for successful professional careers in other places, but was not so true here. Okay, so in the 70s, Bob Dunlap, who was a wonderful entrepreneur, put Francis McMichael and I together and persuaded us to submit a proposal for a grant in the area of retrospective technology assessment. Strange kind of term, isn't it? And there were 85 proposals submitted for that grant, and to our astonishment, we were one of the 4 that got that grant. And that really began my career in the sewers. That sounds like really going down into the wastewater, but it really was immensely important also. I'd already begun doing some work on issues of problems of environmental problems and sewer problems, but this was a major grant, supplied money for graduate students and research, and also the opportunity to work with people like Fran. And there's also a third person on the grant too, though, who's no longer with us. His name is David Wujek. What was Wujek? He was a philosopher of technology. This philosopher of technology has become a fairly well-known opponent of global climate change. I was quite surprised to see that, Granger, when I looked up his biography again. But at any rate, we put this team together and we began to produce a series of papers and reports about the development of wastewater systems in American cities over time, what the key turning points were, what the key individuals were, and so on along the line. And it was a really, I think, a very significant kind of project, very much out of the usual academic mode of a history book, so much so that We couldn't get it published. But so, at least there's articles. We couldn't get the whole thing published. There were many articles that came out of it, but nobody was willing to take it on as a book. But at any rate, again, by being put together with people like Fran, with whom I formed a lifelong bond, it was just really, for me, a wonderful experience and a growth experience, because I learned so much about things I knew so little about. Again, the 70s were significant too, because Bob and I also put together a proposal to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in the area of technology and society that was also funded. And we got $300,000 for 5 years at a time when $300,000 was real money. And then we got a successor grant for another 5 years. So through that money, we were able to set up a series of programs providing for the hiring of a historian of technology, providing for interdisciplinary courses being taught jointly, in some cases by historians and engineers, by social scientists and engineers and so on, research and development courses and things like that. We had money to provide for a speaker series in technology, and so on along the line. It was really the first major interdisciplinary kind of activity of that sort on the campus. And finally, one last thing that happened that was innovative during that period of time was that it had become quite clear to Peter Stearns and myself that the Doctor of Arts program had to go. It had to go not because it hadn't had great success, but it had to go because no longer were they recruiting the exceptional kinds of people they had recruited in the beginning. And also Ted Fenton, to a certain extent, I think, had become tired of it. It lost some of its vitality. And we realized that for the Department of History to do well in Carnegie Mellon University, it had to become a research-oriented department. If it didn't become a research-oriented department, if it stayed oriented towards curriculum design and things like that, it would never get the respect, even though that was meritorious work, the respect we felt was important on the university, so that history would no longer be seen as a service department, but would really be seen as a place where real research took place. And we were able to get that degree approved in 1980, and to set up a PhD program that became a PhD program at that time between history and social sciences. It's called Applied History and Social Sciences. In the history department itself, Dan Resnick, who's here, who's going to be speaking, I know, in a few weeks, played a key role in starting an undergraduate program oriented towards what we call applied history. Then it's now called history and policy. So that history and policy as a focus of the Department of History became something very important on the undergraduate level and on the graduate level. Now, moving in this direction and having all this money to throw around, and I did have a lot at that time, unlike today when I guess I don't have too much in the pocket, meant that I sometimes got into trouble, particularly with department heads that did not like the fact that I was pretty independent. And finally, I got into a bang-down, knockdown fight with the head of the history department at that time, whose name shall not be mentioned. And I decided enough, and Pat Crayson recruited me to go down to social sciences, where there were no senior people down there. It's a new department. And I went down there for 9 years. And so I moved from history to social sciences. I kept the connection in Super at that time. And the 80s, for me, as a decade, were a period when I began to encounter administration. Now, why people would want to make me an administrator, I have no understanding at all, particularly because I had this fight with this particular department head. But in 1986, I was recruited to become the acting dean of SUPA. Brian Berry, famous geographer and a horrible dean. Brian Berry had resigned in mid-year during when he was being evaluated, the second time he was up. And so I remember very well Angel Jordan, the provost at that time, coming to my house. Fourth child was about a year and a half old then, and he came to my house to ask me, would I take on this task? And I remember my wife saying to him, but what's going to happen to my baby? Well, at any rate, at that time I took on that task. I went back to history after I came back from Super, though, because Peter had asked me to rejoin the department, and the department was really moving ahead. And then Steve Feinberg, another very significant person in my life, recruited me to serve as his associate dean for a year. Well, you know how long those things can extend to. And I ended up spending 3 years as associate dean for Steve Feinberg of this college, HNSS. And then what did Steve do? He left. He went off to York University to become a vice president, and I ended up being acting dean of HNSS. So I did that for a year, making it clear that I did not want to take on the task of being a dean all the time. And by the way, I think you have a very strong position if you're an acting person. If you don't care what happens, you can do things you wouldn't do. You know, if you really cared about making enemies by taking some very important, strong steps. I know John never lets that stand in his way, always moves ahead when he can, but John Lahosky, the dean right now. But at any rate, I had this kind of acting career. Not only did I serve as acting dean of HNSS, and I came back and was acting head of the history department for a year. So I really began thinking seriously of applying to the College of Fine Arts. And what happened was that actually in the 80s and 90s, I began to associate with people in fine arts. David Lewis, who's an incredible urban designer, biographer, painter, sculptor, bon vivant, who's somewhere around here. There he is, right there. And I began to associate in the urban lab and in the various urban programs with joint programs and with joint students. And it was, again, immensely rewarding. Then, again, another link with the College of Fine Arts came in the middle 90s when a very strong-willed man of very strong opinions, a person who loved to fight, an Irishman by the name of Tim Collins came to campus. And Tim Collins came here as a visiting environmental artist with his wife, Reiko Goto. And one day, Tim Collins was looking at a story in the newspaper about the plans for what we know as today as Somerset, and for the valley in Frick Park, where there was a huge slag heap. And he noticed in the plans that they had proposed to culvert the stream there. Take 9 Mile Run and put it in a pipe, culvert it. And he said, that shouldn't be. Urban streams are a wonderful resource. So what Tim began to do is put together a team of people, including Bob Bingham, who's here, although you may have been one of the initiators, and called me up and enlisted me. And again, in the middle 90s, at a time when I should have probably been thinking of retirement, I got recruited to serve as part of an interdisciplinary team working on this kind of environmental project. And it is a really significant project that accomplishes great things at Steve Feinberg, if you don't know. This is the way the valley looked. This is a team from 9 Mile Run walking through the valley in 1996. This is their trailer that they had down there to begin to develop the valley as a green corridor and to unculvert the stream and to work with the Corps of Engineers to unculvert the stream. And this is where it looks today. It is obviously an amazingly important contribution, not only to the city and the region, but the United States. It is the largest example of urban stream renewal in the United States. And for me, again, a chance to associate with people like Collins and Goto and Bob Bingham and so on, who come from a very different set of disciplines than I do, think differently than I do, was immensely rewarding and growth, really meant growth. So my journey, you see, my journey there was changing directions at various times, not always because of anything I did, but because of my good fortune and people like Tim Collins are coming to the university and so on. The last point, there's one more team that I did become very involved with too in 1999, which is more, moved back towards engineering, but still environmental. In 1999, I wrote a proposal with Sue McNeil, a wonderful civil engineer who would love to get back here, and Paul Fishback, who's sitting in the back, to do brownfield studies in the region. And again, that was funded. And we began projects in terms of brownfields, studying brownfield renewal, old industrial areas renewal here, that was quite successful in many ways, and resulted in the creation of the Brownfield Center. And Deb was sitting here a moment ago. There she is. And Deb was part of that team. She's now director of the Brownfield Center and also the Steinbrenner Institute. So you've seen the way in which people coming from different directions often coalesced here. All right, the last point I want to make. Let's see if I have any more here. Oh, well, I'll talk about that in a second. The last point I want to make is about my Pittsburgh involvement. If you remember, I came here escaping from Southern California, I was not disappointed in what I found. It reminded me of my roots in Jersey City, you see. But I was also able to get involved in projects such as 9 Mile Run, such as the environmental work I did here, such as the brownfields. That related to the improvement of the city and the region. And one thing about Pittsburgh is that it is a place where you can get involved. It doesn't matter who you are. It's possible to entry into many circles. It's quite easy. People are quite glad to accept your resources and your energy if you're willing to devote it. And I became a very, very devoted to the city as a whole. And some of you may have noticed that I have a chair that I got in 1991. It was called an alumni chair. But then Steve Feinberg said to me, you can put anybody's name on that you want. So I said to my son, well, what should I do? And he said, well, you're very involved in the city of Pittsburgh. Why don't you put Roberto Clementi's name on the chair? And I said, well, I wasn't so sure about the Roberto Clementi chair. But then I had an idea that Dick Caliguiri, who had been the mayor of the city for 10 years, who I knew quite well, who had died just a couple of years before that in office, wonderful, wonderful man, that I could use his name. And I was able to get approval from his widow to do it. And so I became the Caliguiri chair. And I really linked in with the city in many, many ways, at many, many activities. I feel that I belong here. I wouldn't even go back to Jersey City now. And I think that my experience here from the city, the region, but also from the university has been so dynamic and important in terms of the journey that I took. I can't imagine having gone anywhere else where I would have been able to go and do the things that I've done and move in the directions, to penetrate disciplinary boundaries, and to work with people from other disciplines, as well as wonderful historians also, some of whom I was able to recruit, like David Hounshaw right here, a very noted historian of technology. But this kind of involvement beyond a limited domain, I think, is very, very important. And whenever I talk to graduate students or I talk to new faculty, I try to talk to them about that. Reach out, meet people from other disciplines. Try to get involved with them in other kinds of projects. Don't stay necessarily in what can be called the history world. Not that the history world isn't important, it is, but it is not the only world. Okay, let me stop there. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. If anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to try to. Oh, the horse. The horse. In 1971, when I was working on a transportation project, I kept on running into materials that talked about the problems that horses pose for cities, horse manure, dead horses, and so on. So I wrote a little article that was in American Heritage, and it was only accepted there after a fight in the editorial board because some people thought I was apologizing for the automobile. And it was published, and then I moved away from the horse manure, and into sewage, just a step forward. And then in the late 90s, I realized that people were still regarding the horse in a way they shouldn't have. That is, it was not only a polluter, it made it possible for the city to operate. So I got together with an old friend of mine who had been a colleague of mine here for a year, Clay McShane, and we wrote a book called The Horse in the City, Living Machines in the 19th Century, because the horse was a machine. It was more important than the steam engine for much of the 19th century. Cities would not have operated without horses playing all kinds of roles. Well, last year, the American Museum of Natural History in New York City had an exhibit on the horse that was co-curated by Sandy Olson, who's a curator of anthropology at the museum here. And they had these horses, the horses machine in front of the museum. And so now that exhibit is opening in the Carnegie. It's going to be at the Carnegie for 5 months. As a matter of fact, I urge you to go see it because it really brings out the many, many manifest roles that the horse has played over time. Okay?
Okay.